Yeah, I had a 9 a.m. Semi-class, semi-office hours.
So you tend to wake up early, quite easily, right?
Yeah, I prefer waking up early.
Yeah. Good for you. Really? But no, honestly.
Thank you, Clara, for a wonderful meal.
We're starting like.
Thank you.
Hands are drenched.
Yeah, I think you can really choose your like
The live stream?
Yeah, just for the very purpose. It's also annoying though because like if I stay up really late and I'm actually like sleeping, I can't. Like I will still wake up at like 7 and just use it like that.
Hello everyone, my name is Alberto Diaz-Calleros. I am the Director of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford University. We are starting 2023 with our Friday lecture series. Today our first lecture is Destruyendo, semilla, Children and Adolescents as Internal Enemies of the Guatemalan State by Guatemalan Maya Quiché historian María de los Ángeles Aguilar. Kindly note that this lecture is being live streamed and will continue to be available to our YouTube page after the event. If you are joining us through the live stream, please submit your questions and comments through the chat there, and I will make sure that I will be monitoring them and I will read them during our Q&A session at the end of the talk. For those of us who are here at Stanford, I want to remind us that we are here in the land and the territory of the Ohlone original peoples. Yesterday I was in San Francisco and I had not realized that there is actually a mural I had never seen as you enter the mission that actually also declares the Rumatash Ohlone territory as you come into the mission in San Francisco. So what I want to remind us all is that we live in spaces where we can often ignore the reality of the original peoples who inhabit and inhabited those places, those unceded lands, and we should make an effort to learn a little bit about the places where we happen to be, because the signs are always there. We just have to learn to look at them. So we offer our gratitude to the land, to the water, and to the air that surround us, and pay our respects to the past, to the present, and to the future of the Ohlone peoples who continue to be present here in their homelands and also throughout their diasporas. Now to introduce you our guest speaker today, María de los Ángeles Aguilar. She's a Guatemalan Maya Quiché historian. She is currently a postdoctoral associate and also a lecturer at the Council for Latin American and Iberian Studies, at Yale University. She got her PhD from Tulane. Her work, which she's going to share with us, focuses on policing and criminalization in Guatemala during the country's civil war. 1960 to 1996. Her dissertation work explicitly examined the relationship between the Guatemalan National Police and citizens, this is a police force that was expected to be there to serve and to protect. What she does in her work is she learns how the day-to-day element of community protection led the police to create its own criminal subject and its own notion of who the internal enemy was beyond the political subversives. And her work also provides an ethnographic overview of how the social, economic, and cultural conditions of the country affected the police ranks. In Guatemala, she has worked and collaborated with several research projects centered on historical memory, on collective testimony for indigenous community and genocide survivors. So, María de los Ángeles Aguilar, it's a pleasure to have you here today with us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here, and I want to thank the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford for the kind invitation. And what I'm going to share with you today is a draft of a project that I'm currently working on. It derives from my dissertation work, but I'm taking this into a slightly different direction, focusing on children and adolescents in Guatemala. So my talk for today is Destruyendo la semilla, children and adolescents as internal enemies of the Guatemalan state. On March 4th of 1990, 4 members of the Guatemalan National Police brutally beat a group of children and youth found inhaling glue in the streets of Guatemala City. After the beating, the police poured contact cement over their heads and left. Naaman Cardona, who was only 12 years old, did not survive. While the initial hospital intake report listed the reason for admittance as intoxication, through a later examination, it was determined that over 70% of his body was covered in bruises. He presented several broken bones, and his liver and other major internal organs were completely crushed. Casa Alianza, a private center that cared for abused and abandoned children, pushed for an investigation, and through testimony from survivors, 4 police officers were arrested months later and charged with murder. This was one of the few cases where the police was held accountable. Naaman's death was not an isolated incident. Instead, the violence committed against him was part of a social cleansing campaign carried out by the Guatemalan National Police in the early 1990s against alleged street children, as they called them. From 1990 to 1995, according to press reports, Casa Alianza had filed 188 lawsuits against government authorities, which included accusations related to 26 murders, 46 cases of assault, which included torture, 60 cases of abuse of authority, 15 kidnappings, 13 illegal arrests, 7 death threats, 6 accusations of intimidation, 4 cases of sexual assault, 4 instances of physical abuse, 4 accusations of rape, 3 accusations of threat, and 1 accusation of aiding and abetting in the use and sale of inhalants. The complaints were against 282 individuals. Of these, 101 were members of the National Police. The criminalization and use of cruelty against children and adolescents was not a new phenomenon in Guatemala. During the height of the country's civil war, which lasted officially from 1960 to 1996, children were targets of the genocidal and other violent campaigns of the Guatemalan state. Fetuses, babies, toddlers, children, and adolescents were criminalized. Many were massacred, assassinated, or disappeared. Those who survived served to fuel the booming and mainly illegal adoption business that flourished in Guatemala. It's important to add that many of these children were indigenous and poor. This work, as I mentioned, is the first draft of an article that seeks to explore the criminalization process of the Guatemalan state against children and youth during the country's civil war. Children who, for the most part, had not committed any crimes but were deemed criminal nonetheless. Moreover, it seeks to contribute to an analysis of how state-sponsored violence affected children throughout Latin America during the period of the Cold War. Often children are presented solely as victims without expanding on the process of how the states construed the narrative that validated their death, their disappearance, and present-day violence and criminalization process used against children and minors, especially when we look at present-day narratives regarding Maras, but other youth groups as well. Data regarding the effects of violence against children during the Guatemalan armed conflict is scarce. Most is found in human rights and press reports and in the country's truth reports. Nevertheless, in both urban and rural areas, children were not spared from the state-sponsored campaigns that ravaged the country during the second half of the 20th century. The United Nations Commission for Historical Clarification determined that 1/5 of the total victims of the conflict were children. Additionally, the Commission estimated that out of the 45,000 disappeared, 5,000 were children, accounting for 11% of the disappeared. Here it's important to mention that the same commission allocated 93% of the responsibility of violence to the state security forces, meaning that the disappearance and killing of children and youth was part of an internal process of the Guatemalan state. For this presentation, I will focus on both rural and urban youth, remarking on the ways in which the state criminalized and enacted violence against both, albeit in somewhat different methods. In rural areas, the violence against children was systematic, it was sickening, and above all, it was in mass. The brutal murder of minors, which included ripping fetuses out of the bellies of pregnant women, was part of the genocidal campaign waged by the military leaders in power. In addition, some of the children who survived the massacres were given up for adoption to foreign families or abducted by the military or placed in condition of servitude with their perpetrators. Military manuals used in the 1980s during the height of the genocidal campaigns in the region of El Quiché, the department with the greatest numbers of massacres committed, revealed that as part of the Army's definition of irregular local forces, meaning individuals considered to be unarmed but carrying out self-defense actions against the Army and who therefore needed to be eliminated, they also included the elderly and children. The latter, a group who the military referred to with the codename Chocolates, chocolates. In a message contained in Operación Sofia, a declassified secret military document about the operations in this region, an entry from July 22, 1982 stated that the troops had captured 18 people, including 12 children. 2 days later, another ciphered message noted that 10 families were evicted from the area. Contained in the group were 17 girls, 15 boys, and 1 newborn. A day later, 17 kids and another newborn were said to be evacuated from the region. I could go on. This is one of the examples of the messages that were sent. A common thread is that there is no further information about the whereabouts of the families or the children. Here it's important to pause and ask why the state included children as part of the irregular forces that needed to be combated. Was it due to their potential dangerous aptitudes, or because of the future they represented, Indian and rebellious? Everything the feudal and racist economic, political, and military elite of the country feared. That is why it's not surprising that when reviewing the details related to the more than 600 massacres that were committed in the country during the war, youth, children, and the unborn were often part of the casualties. They were seen as subversive seeds that needed to be destroyed, and we have more than enough proof of this. One of the most well-known cases of violence targeted directly at children is the March 13, 1982 massacre at Rio Negro, Verapaz, where civil patrolmen and members of the army arrived to the town of Rio Negro, and in the absence of men who had decided to hide in the mountains, thinking that they were the sole target of the security apparatus, proceeded to massacre 107 children and 70 women. Horrific cases like these are not the exception. More recently, during exhumations carried out in the Comando Regional de Entrenamiento de Operaciones de Mantenimiento de la Paz, a very long name for a space that is used to train UN peacekeeping troops. This place used to be a military camp. They found one of the largest mass graves in the country. In this space, 558 remains have been found so far. Of these, it's been determined that 90 of them belong to minors. And this continues to this day. In an exhumation from last year, members of the FAFG, the Forensic Anthropology Foundation, they recover these children's items and toys from another mass grave from the region of El Quiché. Now, as the introduction to this paper noted, urban children and youth were not immune from the violence. I argue that the criminalization of urban youth and minors by the Guatemalan state should be viewed as part of an intentional process that sought to construct a new type of historical and political criminal, one that assured compliance regarding the extraction of their labor, but also obedience to the Criollo and Latino settler nation-state project. And I'll give a few examples, but one common thread is how the government security forces treated children and youth as adults, while also separating them from their social context and economic conditions that force many into activities deemed illegal by the state. One of the best examples is how minors were often charged by the police with the crime of vagrancy. This was a practice observed since the late 1800s that was used to regulate the labor of indigenous and poor families in Guatemala. Based on the 1932 Vagrancy Code, out of the 10 possible infractions that place people in the category of vagrants, 4 applied to children or minors. And these were, and I quote, those who did not have a job or an occupation, those who were found begging in the streets, those who did not have a known home, and students registered in public or private schools who miss classes without a permit, unquote. Although I would like to note that the generosity of a special provision within this code noted that those younger than 14 were not obligated to work. Here we see a slide with an order to control vagrancy, the children vagrancy, and this is in the police archives. So we see a link between the extraction of labor and the structural poverty and how both coalesce to add to the process of criminalization. A lot of the times the children who were found begging in the street were internal migrants or migrants from other regions. Those who were found outside the schools perhaps had to make other means to live. So to delve deeper into how the security forces blur the line between adults and minors, I would like to now turn to one of the most valuable visual sources contained in the police archive, the Álbum de Delincuentes, or Album of Delinquents. This album is composed of 38 separate books containing an estimated 80,000 mugshots and other photographs of alleged criminals captured by the National Police. In some instances, the mugshots are accompanied by a brief description of the crime along with the name and alias of the accused. An analysis of these albums reveal how the police, through their data keeping, contributed to a symbolic violence that eventually transformed into structural violence. Violence that to this day continues to affect certain groups of the population contained in said albums, such as immigrants, the poor, women, youth, sex workers, members of the LGBTQ community, and of course, children and adolescents. A prominent feature of these albums are the photographs of minors, especially young boys, scattered through the pages, their faces mixing with the photographs of adult men. And here you can see an example of that with this child right there. Their portraits, alongside those of adults, depict minors as criminal subjects, placing them on par with the adult criminal. Most of the minors depicted in the album were accused of robbery or theft. Many were surely captured for violating the vagrancy law, although others were charged with more serious crimes such as murder or attempted rape or engaging in prostitution. Portraying youth as criminals was not a new practice for the police during the war. Here you can see a story published in the police magazine, the Gaceta de la Policía, discussing a case of youth criminality in the city in the 1940s. However, by looking at the album, we see how the police's construction of the children and adolescent as criminal was systematic. The police did not always include the name of the minors, opting instead for their aliases. This was the case of La Pulga and El Loco, two minors arrested for shoplifting in 1956. Whether their aliases were self-chosen or given by the police is unknown, yet in this specific case, they seem to represent the twisted vision authorities had of children and teens in the second half of the 20th century. Small, bothersome, foolish, but above all, a pest. The inclusion of minors among a group of adult criminals raises a key question. What was the position of children in the social imaginary of the state in the second half of the 20th century, a time in which the country forcefully and violently transitioned from a 10-year revolutionary project that sought to enact social reform to a period of counter-revolution and eventually an armed conflict, a war that officially began in 1960 and whose some claim came to an end in 1996. I still have my doubts. After all, historically, as some historians have noted, specifically Deborah Levinson and Heather Brana, youth in the country have been a driving force behind the political change in the 1920s and in the 1940s, and despite the war, they continue to be a force. For example, in March and April of 1962, students in Guatemala City organized and promoted a series of protests known as the Jornadas de Marzo y Abril, one of the most important series of student mobilizations in the country, in which middle, high school, and university students demanded the resignation of the president, Miguel Fuentes. Despite the growing government repression, which increased in the years later, youth continue organizing. During one of the city's most important strikes in October of 1978, as part of the nationwide protests and riots against a bus fare increase, the media reported the arrest of over 179 minors in the first few days of the demonstrations. Police sources also show how on certain occasions school authorities called on the police to use the vagrancy law to persecute students who were meeting outside of the school buildings. And here you see an example of this. This is a request for the police to go to a school to combat vagrancy. Historian Deborah Levinson has argued that, I quote, "The defeat of the popular and revolutionary organizations and years of neoliberal policies," unquote, marked a shift in the perceptions of youth. They went from being considered the heroic future of the nation to nothing more than a criminal enemy to be combated. But I argue that while the shift was exacerbated by neoliberalism, by looking at police and military sources, we can notice how the narrative developed by both the army and the police about criminality and danger of these groups, in which they normalized the use of violence against minors. It was an essential part of the violence of the armed conflict. Thus, the youth's transformation into an enemy was a process central to the counterinsurgency project of the Criollo state. And now I'd like to turn to another example, the Diario Militar. This one-of-a-kind military document was made public in May 29th of 1999 by a United States archivist from the National Security Archive. This document is composed of several sections, but one contains the information about the fate of 175 individuals who were captured and disappeared by security forces. Entry 52 and 86 are specific about the capture of two young boys. The first is Prudencio de Jesus Carrera, a 15-year-old who was captured on January 21st, 1984, and according to records, killed on February 7th, 1984. He was kept alive for 2 weeks after his capture. Entry 86 corresponds to Juan Pablo Almira, who was 12 years old at the time of his capture on March 10th, 1984. He was accused of connecting and paying for the security homes used by the FARC, one of the guerrilla groups operating in the country. He was sent to the military base in Chimaltenango in the outskirts of Guatemala City, and his whereabouts are unknown to this day. Entry 99 refers to Narcisa Cusanero Xian, captured with two small children, who, and I quote, "due to humanitarian reasons, were turned over to the BROE," unquote. The BROE was one of the most violent units in the Guatemalan National Police. The ultimate location of the children and her is unknown. The forced disappearance of children was a systematic practice in both urban and rural areas, as I mentioned. But in the city, children were also used as a bargaining material against individuals suspected or known to be participating in revolutionary groups, but also against those rallying around organizations demanding truth and justice from the government. For example, Marco Antonio Molina Tyson was 14 years old when he was kidnapped by members of the military after his sister managed to escape from military detention. To this day, his mother and sisters continue to demand the perpetrators reveal his whereabouts. On September 11th of 1981, security forces carried out 2 operations which resulted in the kidnapping of 6 members of the Portillo family, including 3 young girls ages 10, 9, and 18 months. These operations were common in war-torn Guatemala City. An updated document belonging to the Centro de Operaciones Conjuntas, a joint unit between the army and the police, described what they called operaciones de batida, or raid operations. These are striking because of their similarities to the way the army conducted their own operations in rural areas, which mostly require separating men from women and children to interrogate, torture, rape, and eventually murder them. In the document that I looked at from the Centro de Operaciones Conjuntas, in 3 paragraphs, this unit is very clear and concise in describing the achievements and execution of their operations. They first indicate that to successfully identify insurgent individuals in certain areas of the city, the deployed unit should use 4 different tactics, encirclement, assembly, search, and retention. The police unit oversaw fencing of the site, and they looked to keep people in custody for interrogation. Then the police separated the men, the women, and children to prevent them from communicating with each other. After that, they requested IDs, and the police questioned each adult individually and compare their answers with the answers of others to detect possible irregularities or lies, as they claimed. So we see how children are included as part of these groups of suspected individuals. Another document, an intelligence report from the same unit, this one dated in 1980, determined that in the so-called subversive cells, I quote, their members tried to live a normal life, using the elderly, women, and children as couriers, unquote. According to this unit, clandestine organizations, I quote, use children playing in the vicinity of security facilities to carry out intelligence work, unquote. This association between women, older adults, and above all children signals that security forces do not differentiate by age or gender in their efforts to identify so-called subversives. Portraying minors as criminal and subversive subjects shows a sinister process of criminalization at the hands of the military state and of its security forces. The authorities viewed the youth and minors as delinquents and also as subversives, but not as a group that was deserving the protection of the state. In a 1984 summary, the police reported that in Guatemala City there were several gangs of robbers made up of minors who committed petty theft and who, according to the police, were dangerous because they used, and I quote, sharp-edged weapons, unquote. The report further added, I quote, the situation is complicated by the fact that they are not legally considered criminals, and as such, they enjoy certain privileges that allow them to go unpunished for the acts they commit. The juvenile courts do not impose prison sentence on them, and they are unable to do so. Even if they are arrested for committing a serious crime, they are released a few days later. This unique situation means that although they lead a criminal life, they enjoy their freedom. As a result, they are uncontrollable, unquote. The general, superficial, and conservative police analysis of minors clarifies that there was no questioning of the historical, socioeconomical, political, or repressive conditions that led minors to incur in activities deemed as vagrancy or criminal, or to join criminal gangs in the context of the armed conflict, and especially in the bloodiest decade of the armed conflict, the 1975 to 1985. In many cases, the gangs were not only made up of minors, according to the police, they were led by adults, and as some reports indicate, underage women were also part of these criminal gangs. However, categorizing them as uncontrollable served to create a vilified subject that needed to be controlled through violent and drastic measures, since, as the police argued, neither they nor the courts had the strategy or power to deter them from a life of crime. Through the sources, one can also see a frustration with the courts and their inability, according to the police, to keep offenders in jail, whether they were minors or not. As another police report added, I quote, the courts are more concerned with their care than with sanctioning them. Therefore, using minors in robberies is easy and risk-free, unquote. The criminalization of minors by the police indicates that its security agenda was responsible for constructing a narrative of children as a sector to be punished and even eliminated. These descriptions of ungovernability led to the social cleansing campaigns of the 1990s, with which I began this presentation. The cases reached a high point in February of 1991, when Guatemalan legislators made accusations against the national police and the military for engaging in, I quote, systematic torture and assassination of children, unquote. The president of the Committee of Protection of Minors in the Guatemalan Congress, Mario Taracena Diaz, stated, I quote, there is strong evidence that leads us to suspect that secret prisons exist in the capital of Guatemala where street children are abducted and incarcerated. These children are subsequently tortured and assassinated, unquote. In 1960, Guatemalan revolutionary poet Otto René Castillo wrote a poem titled Retorno a la Sonrisa, Return to a Smile. in which he boldly stated, I quote, "I, a man in struggle in the middle of the 20th century, say, the children born at the end of the century will be happy," unquote. Castillo, who was killed by the Guatemalan army in 1967, was not alive to know that the destruction of children's lives was a genocidal strategy of the Guatemalan army in rural areas. Not that in urban areas, the army would kidnap and disappear children in a strategy of retaliation against their families' activism, and that in the decade of the 1990s, the Guatemalan National Police carried out social cleansing campaigns targeted who they called street children and youth. Otto René Castillo failed to imagine that at the end of the 20th century, Guatemala, alongside with other Central American countries, would have successfully turned children and teens into internal enemies of the state. Children who were simply trying to survive poverty and the political violence that permeated their countries. Here I would like to add that Naam Cardona, the 12-year-old child who I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, was Salvadorian. His family migrated to Guatemala, fleeing their own civil war. It was there that they sought survival, and he sought survival in the streets. That is why, in the eyes of the state and its security forces, his life and the life of many other children and youth was disposable. They did not belong to their idea of the nation. In 2010, another Guatemalan poet, Julio Serrano, responded to Castillo's verse by writing, "Perhaps you meant this century," referring to the 21st century. I have my doubts. On March 8th, 2017, in Guatemala City, 34 underage girls under the care of a state-run children's home, Hogar Seguro Virgen de la Asunción, were locked in a room by members of the Guatemalan police and the director of the home. They perished inside a fire, in the facilities by a fire. The girls had long complained and rebelled against this home and their authorities, who they accused of enacting various forms of violence, including sexual violence against them. That is why the night before, a group of 56 girls escaped the confines of the home, only to be captured by the police and to be locked in a room. After several hours without food and access to a bathroom, some of the girls inside started a fire, trying to get the attention of authorities and the police who were outside, hoping that the smoke would encourage them to open the door and let them out. This was not the case. 34 girls died inside the room. 7 more would perish in the days following. The authorities, local media, and even sectors of society created a discourse that presented these girls, the youngest of which was only 14 years old, as violent as criminals and as unmanageable. Adjectives found in the press described them as, quote, groups of inmates in need of discipline, troublemakers, criminals, delinquents, mareras, human waste. According to one of the survivors, one of the police officers present said, "Let these wretches suffer." The Secretary of Social Welfare claimed that the girls had sharp weapons hidden in their hair. Their deaths were not the fault of the state, but of them and their families. Opinion columns published at the time even questioned whether children should be considered victims or perpetrators, perhaps. The international press was a bit more forgiving. Speaking to a New Yorker article, Maria Elena Villarreal said of the children inside these homes, I quote, "It doesn't matter what the children endure because they're indigenous or because they're extremely poor, so no one cares," unquote. To this day, the former Guatemalan president who gave the order to keep the girls locked in the room, the director of the children's home, and members of the police responsible for their deaths remained free. So like Serrano, my deepest hope is that Otto René Castillo did really mean this century, and that the children, as Otto René Castillo said, will rise as the sun made of butterflies after a tropical storm, unquote, and as he hoped, and that we can all contribute to a country and a region in which the children will indeed be happy. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. So we can open up to some questions. I guess I'll be monitoring the YouTube chat in case we get some questions also, but maybe let's second one.
I have a question. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Danny, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for this talk. It was amazing to hear you. I just wanted to ask a bit about sort of your access to these records and these like sort of government records, and so how was building that relationship with these centers, and especially those related more to the army forces and the national forces. How was that sort of how was getting that access, I guess, is my question.
It's not very easy, but I was very lucky at the time. But I also have to add that the military records that I shared are all accessible online. These have been declassified. The Diario Militar is one of its kind because it was smuggled out of Guatemala. It is believed that there are more of reports like that one that listed the whereabouts and the fate of many of the disappeared, but that is the only one that was able to be smuggled out of the country. And then, as I mentioned, an archivist in the National Security Archive in Washington University has done a lot of work with that document, and you can find it online. Operación Sofia and other military documents were also declassified in the 1990s, and they are also available online. They were used in the genocide trial against Efraín Ríos Montt in 2010. But you can also find those online, which is why I've used those. Now, the police records, that is a different story. My work has focused on the Guatemalan police because Guatemala has the largest police archive in all of Latin America. It was discovered by accident in 2005. And due to the country's freedom of information access law, they were open and they were access to anyone who wanted to consult them. There was a lot of work done in terms of organizing, cleaning the documents. They were in a really bad state. But eventually researchers, but most importantly family members who were looking for their loved ones could have access to this archive. Unfortunately, due to changes in politics, the archive has now technically shut down. It's technically still open, but they've defunded the archives. They've fired the majority of the workers, and access to its documents is a lot more restricted. But by the time that I conducted my research, I was able to go to the archive, have access to the documents, and there are also some documents that are available online.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was very curious towards one of the elements you mentioned towards how this language of youth as criminals is permeated even into journalism today, in this case of these young women. I'm curious if you saw any patterns on which kind of journalism was the one using these words, if it was more ideological to the right, to the left, or if it was homogeneously spread across all newspapers in Guatemala.
Yeah, that's a great question. It was mainly the right, but the children, criminals, well, victims or perpetrators, quote, that came from a leftist, left-leaning publication. Yeah, so you did find a little bit of that language even there.
Can I put a question from the YouTube channel? This is Hector Callejas, who's asking if you can tell us a little bit about how the settler state looks like in Guatemala. So this history of youth criminalization in Guatemala, what does it reveal in your mind about settler colonialism in Central America, not just in Guatemala? So specific to Guatemala and I guess to the whole Central American region.
Yeah, well, maybe I will focus more on Guatemala for my answer. But the link that I'm trying to make, and as I mentioned, this is a work in progress, is I want to focus more on the vagrancy aspect and how these arrests and this criminalization of children and teenagers who were considered vagrant also is breaking with the mold of the state in regards to how they viewed certain groups and their labor. So the poor and the indigenous were seen as the ones who had to provide the labor for the nation. That's why there were vagrancy laws and other laws that forced indigenous peoples to provide labor for 100 days a year, or if they didn't, if they fell in one of the categories that I mentioned, and there were others that I didn't mention, they were considered vagrant, right? So I'm trying to make that link of how the nation had this idea of belonging, and part of that belonging meant where you fitted in this classification and what labor you provided to the nation. And I'm trying to make this link about how these children who for various reasons were not providing the labor that the state wanted them to provide are then criminalized and persecuted by the security forces.
Yeah. Mo?
I have a question about some of the reporting or the calls for the police to come to one of the schools to address the vagrancy around it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know have you been able to find what are the groups making these calls or asking the police to come do this? Like, was it the school? Do you know?
Yeah, in this case that I showed, I'm assuming it was school authorities who were calling the police. Because of the organization of students that I mentioned in the 60s, starting mainly in the 60s, they were marching and they were demanding resignations of presidents, and they all met outside of the schools to plan for the day protests. So this was also a strategy of school authorities to combat the group of children and adolescents who were organizing politically. But also in some cases, the teachers were also involved in the social movements. So I have not found specific cases of who's the one who called on the police. It might have been some school authorities. I've done other work in terms of civilians supporting the police, and you find that sometimes it's the most random case of a passerby who sees the group and will immediately go to the police to denounce what they perceive as a crime.
Can I follow up on one of Danny's questions? So one of the things that is striking is a little bit the intent of these files. Now, who is constructing these files is a clerk, you would think, within the police force, and they're trying to do it for a particular purpose. And I worry. No, I don't worry. I wonder. For example, you have this the one you showed very early, the one that says this population has been reubicados, I think was the word, or some word like that. Was it that they knew they were just saying code words for disappeared? I mean, who are they thinking this will never be seen in public, so therefore they can be very blunt about what they're doing? I mean, what's the intention? What are they trying to do in these records? Or is it that this is a very professionalized police force is trying to keep track of everything very by the book? I mean, I'm trying to understand how this is produced. No?
Yeah. So the relocation, that was from a military record, and that was from the unit on the ground to their superiors. But that's one of the questions that is often asked regarding the police archive. Why is it still there? Why does it exist? They were bureaucracies, and they wanted to show that they were doing their work. So in the case of the military records, they were telling their superiors that they were in fact carrying out the operations of moving communities from one area to the other, relocating communities that were believed to be supporting subversive forces. So it was an entire strategy of the genocide that took place in Guatemala, the relocation of families and of indigenous communities for the most part. So they're letting their superiors know that they're doing the work. In the case of the police files, there was an increase in the systematization process after the coup, after 1954. The United States provided a lot of military aid, not just in training, but also in terms of organizing and systematization for the police. So that is where we see an increase in records, because they had the means and the training to try to mimic the process that police forces were carrying out in other countries. That the mugshots and all of this became part of the police actions in the 1800s. It was much later that took place in Guatemala, but it was part of that bureaucracy that was showing that they were, in fact, doing their work.
Can I read you a question from Joseph Wagner? Wagner, I'm not sure. Wagner. Thank you for a great talk on such a painful topic. So many questions, but he wants to be juicioso and only mention 2 questions. First, what role do cultural products, such as art or literature, such as Rodrigo Rey Rosas' El Material Humano, play in bringing light to these issues and the guarantee of no repetición, never again? A second question, what advantages and drawbacks do you see in appealing to international legal mechanisms or pursuing cases in international courts for addressing the practice of genocide, disappearance of youth?
Can you repeat the second question?
So the second one is the use of international courts, systems of international law to appeal, to address these questions of genocide.
So regarding the first question about culture, the book he mentioned is one of the first that mentioned sources from the police archive. Rey Rosas, a Guatemalan writer who was able to access some of the early records and wrote a sort of novel about it. But I think that is also why I mentioned Otto René Castillo, right? There's the academic work, but that also has its limits in terms of who we can reach as an audience. And then you have other types of work that are perhaps more suited or can reach a wider audience, especially when it comes to subjects of violence, where these are, hard things to hear. And for example, if you're explaining this to, children, right, to other children, how do we let them know about this history of violence in a way that's more appropriate for them? So I think that's where we see the role of cultural writers, poets, visual artists come into play to tell the story. And in terms of the international mechanisms for justice, there's been several attempts and several successes. There's been cases that have reached the Inter-American Court of Human Rights at a national, and that's certainly helped in terms of advancing the cases in national courts. So, for example, the genocide case in Guatemala was able to advance because there were other attempts done in international courts, specifically Spain. But there have been other cases. I mentioned very briefly the case of Creon Paz. That is a case that is currently stuck in a national court. But that one was able to begin because there was a different case of another massacre that reached the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the sentence order that the Guatemalan state investigate what happened. And through that investigation is that they found the case of Creon Paz. So it's definitely a mechanism that needs to be used. It's something that is definitely helpful, but it's not the solution. Mm-hmm. You can have a sentence in an inter-American court or international court. That doesn't mean that the sentence will be enacted at a national level. And even when you have a sentence in your favor, that doesn't mean that justice is served. The case of Marco Antonio Molina Tyson that I mentioned, there was a sentence in an international court, there was a sentence in a national court that found members of the military guilty, and yet to this day his family has not been able to find his body. So there we see that justice is still incomplete.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and powerful talk and presentation. And I was wondering, what has the public response been, especially since the 2017 massacre, and how has that changed since the 1950s and since the start of this violence against children?
I think that one of the problems is that we don't recognize the violence as historic. We think that it just starts with the maras or gangs, right, in Central America. So that's sort of where I'm trying to take my work to look at this in more historic terms. But in more recent years, there's been definitely a lot of demonstrations and actions to bring light to the violence that's been enacted against children, especially young girls. There's also a lot of sexual violence that also was historic in the country, but that is ongoing even to this day against young women and against girls, and this is the Hogar Seguros is an example of that. So there's definitely been more movement to bring attention to that. It's still very hard. The several collectives that work with the families of the survivors or with the families of the girls built a monument right in front of the National Palace, and it's been constantly destroyed. They've rebuilt it several times and it keeps getting destroyed, so there's definitely a conversation that not everyone wants to have. I think it's easy to blame the girls or their families for the failures of the state.
There's a question from Laura Matthew here. Thank you for an excellent talk. Could you talk more about how the military government conceived or thought about urban student protesters, for example, national university or high school students, versus those targeted in the rural communities, or urban criminal vagrants? Did they treat them all as the same threat, or were there different discourses for the urban and the rural?
Oh, that's a great question. That's something that I want to keep expanding on as I keep working on this. But I would say now that there is definitely a difference, the same way that there was a difference that the violence was enacted in rural versus urban spaces. In rural areas, it was massive. It has the racist component of genocide. They were all seen as indigenous communities, despite age, were seen as internal enemies. The reports of the massacres are incredibly hard to read. That doesn't mean that the violence in urban areas was not as terrible. It's just it operated differently. Violence was more selective. Young students were often killed and disappeared, and they were definitely tortured, but the violence was not experienced in the same massive way as in rural areas. And I also think that the racial analysis is different, how they're seeing university students or even high school students. They're racialized as white, as Latino, or as non-indigenous. So that is also part of how the violence enacted against them. It's still brutal, but it's different than what we see in the rural areas.
Can I add one more question? I mean, it's a little bit of a follow-up on Jose's question. But so Pablo Picato has written this great work on Mexican red, la nota roja, no, like the prensa amarillista. I don't know how you call that, but and how all this usually are also the police officers themselves are feeding the journalists. So I wanted to know a little bit more. I mean, because part of it is this might be very secret archives, but there's also this public consumption of criminalization, of making the stories of the youth. So I wanted to ask you, did you research that part as well of the Nota Roja as a possible source?
Yes, I definitely have taken that into consideration. For example, one of the first images that I showed of 1941, that was part of the police magazine. That was part of these Notas Rojas that the police themselves published that follow this trend of amarillismo, right? To also scare the population and contribute to this criminal subject, the creation of this criminal subject. And I think we don't have that same magazine now, but we still see that a lot of the information is passed from the police to news reporters. The way that there's been a very, for me, horrific use of photographs of crime scenes and victims that is used by members of the press, that they also, so there's also what the police give them, but also what the members of the media should be held accountable for contributing to the narrative and for publishing certain stories. But we also see, when we listen to programs of political analysis and when we read opinion columns, we also see that even separate from what the police is contributing in terms of sources, there's this also this dehumanization of certain sectors of the population that allow members of the media or analysts to publish these types of narratives that blame the victim.
So we have time for maybe one more question. I'll read from the YouTube channel, if that's okay. Oh, there's two now. But okay, Raizit Ima is asking, thank you for such an important talk and your contribution to this research. And the question is about what is the core significance for the authorities? Why do the authorities want to criminalize the youth in Guatemala? And I'll read you the other one. You can take whatever you can of both questions. What are, if you can mention some names of collectives that have built the monument you show us, and how are weaving cooperatives within the textile industry also protecting and fostering safe spaces for women? If you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Okay.
Very different questions.
Yeah, the second one's a little out of my expertise, but the why, I think that's sort of part of it is what I mentioned, this idea of belonging to the nation, right? Who belongs, who doesn't belong, what type of youth belongs, those who attend school but don't question, those who follow orders, those who align with the military state that was in power at the time. In rural areas, it was those communities that also aligned with the state, who followed on the counterinsurgency orders, who agreed to relocate to what they called model communities, which were basically concentration camps for indigenous communities. So in both spaces, you have this idea of who belongs and who can be part of the nation's military, the military project during that time. And so I think that's where we see how these young children who are perhaps living in the street, trying to make their living day to day, not attending school, or if they're attending school, they're also organizing politically, they're falling out of this idea of belonging. So I think that's why we see this criminalization process. And in terms of the weaving, I would have, I think that's a very different topic, but it's definitely something that there's a lot of women who are organizing for different reasons in terms of weaving. There's, just because it's a cultural protection, but also in terms of law to protect their design. So I think that's a lot that can be discussed there. And in terms of the organizations, there's feminist women's organizations. This is one of them, UNAMGE. But there's other groups that have also helped some of the victims. Some were created by the survivors. There's also collectives of artists who collaborated to create portraits of the girls to have a different image than what the police were showing or the authorities were showing in their official pictures. So I think there's different sectors that can be found.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today for the talk with Maria de Los Angeles Aguilar, for sharing her expertise and her passion for this work. Please do tune into our Friday seminar. This seminar series in this quarter, we're emphasizing a bit more questions of history and issues of indigenous peoples in the way we have done last quarter. A lot of the talks were about educating ourselves on the Afro-descendant populations in the hemisphere, not just Latin America. So I do want to remind people you can look at those past lectures in our YouTube channel. So next week we'll have Mateo Carrillo on disparate development, gender geographies, ejidos, urbanization, and the maquila industry in Ciudad Juárez. But today, thank you so much for the talk today.
Thank you so much.